Welcome to Cybersecurity Sense, a weekly podcast providing updates and insight into the latest in cybersecurity. Brought to you by LBMC Information Security. Now, here's your host.
Hi, my name's Drew Hendrickson with LBMC Information Security. I'm a shareholder, and I help lead our efforts under privacy and specifically, while we're here today, the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR.
All right, Drew. So this is actually part 2 of a series we're doing all about GDPR. Now, before we start talking about what we're saying is things to consider, which are all the areas you need to be thinking about and seriously considering as you're navigating the waters of GDPR. Before we talk about that, 2 announcements. One, someone should maybe go back and listen to the other one, maybe just in case if we want to get the full picture of what we're saying. But the second thing I'll say is to kind of catch them up, there are 3 questions that determine if GDPR applies to you. So how about we just revisit those really fast, and then let's jump straight into things to consider.
Yeah, so what we want to talk about today is if GDPR is applicable to you and you've determined it is, that you want to continue listening. Those
Right.
3 questions were, are you established in the EU? Are you monitoring behavior within the EU? And are you offering services? And it's just one of those. If you answer yes to any of those 3, it's applicable to you.
What if you answer maybe to one of those 3?
Talk to your privacy or legal professional. Yeah, give me a call.
All right, and it's very quite possible that, they're not playing around. So let's jump into things to consider. Now, one of the things we started to talk about on the previous part was personal data. So what is, air quotes, personal data? Especially, what is that under GDPR?
Yeah, so personal data under GDPR is a little bit different than organizations in the United States might be used to. A lot of companies here are used to PII, or personally identifiable information, and especially healthcare organizations are used to PHI or EPHI, which is protected health information, or if you have the E, electronic protected health information. And so not everybody, but a lot of people are very familiar with that.
And what's a phrase that goes along with that usually that you're familiar with hearing?
Yeah, well, those 2 are pretty common, but just understanding sensitive information or information that you'd want to protect. And
any healthcare, and that's all healthcare related, or any kind of?
No, any kind of company. The protected health information is definitely specific to healthcare organizations, but PII, your bank deals with that. A lot of companies are obtaining your name, your address, your social security number. Those things have always been considered fairly sensitive in the United States anyway.
That makes sense. Now, when we look at these, when you talk about anything that would identify you, personally identifiable information, that's what you're talking about here.
Well, for the GDPR, it's just personal data. So the terms are very similar to PII. So the key difference here with GDPR, personal data is defined very differently. So an IP address, race, religion, gender, information that might not be considered specific to you under the United States definition of personally identifiable information is considered personal data under GDPR. So if you're collecting IP addresses, that's personal data under GDPR, and you need to think about how you're complying.
Wow. So it's covering a much larger ground size. So, and that's, wow. Okay.
More data to protect.
A lot more data to protect, right?
Yeah.
So we did mention, we talked a little about Facebook in that last session, and basically that was just kind of thinking about how have they been preparing, but also B, they've been catching some flack in the EU on some things, and they've had to pay some fines under some of what happened. But when you think of a group like Facebook or any of these social media sites, I mean, that personal data, while you can't identify someone specifically from it, but your gender, religion, all that stuff. How do you anticipate that's going to be different than what they're doing now? But that's just a total game changer, right?
Yeah, well, it's more information that you need to protect and understand where it is. So that information may have been not protected or encrypted. They may not have thought about how they're complying.
Third parties
with
having
other
access
objectives.
to it.
Sure, yeah, lots of different things that they might not have thought before. A lot of this, especially the larger social media sites, are probably well prepared up to this point. But even other organizations that, somebody clicks on your website and you collect that IP address Is that an EU citizen, and are you doing that quite frequently? How does that impact your organization? What do you need to be thinking about? What do you need to do to protect that information, especially under GDPR?
Wow. All right. Now, let's say that information, you've not protected it the way you need to be, and there's some sort of breach. Let's talk about that next.
Yeah.
What's the differences here than what we've seen before on things we're familiar with?
Yeah, so there's other breach notification regulations out there. So under HIPAA, for instance, there's breach notification regulations and rules there, right? Under GDPR, there's no difference from the standpoint of what a breach is. It's just what has been breached. So what was breached is very different on the GDPR. So a data breach, there's data breach, right, in air quotes, there's no specific requirement. But if it was a personal data breach, so we just talked a lot about that personal data. If that personal data was breached, there are some specific requirements. The first one is that you need to notify a supervisory authority, which is normally going to be one of those data protection authorities that we talked about in our first series or first
first episode. Yeah, one of those things, right?
Yeah. The difference is under GDPR, personal data, when it's breached, there's a very different rule there. So if you're breached there, you have 72 hours to notify a supervisory authority, which is more than likely going to be a data protection authority that we talked about in our first episode. It could be someone else, but you definitely want to understand who are your data protection authorities. You may have more than one if you're operating in several jurisdictions within Europe. So you have 72 hours there unless it's likely to cause substantial harm to that individual. So if it is, you may have an out to not let them know. But it's 72 hours from the breach, so that's pretty fast. That's noticing the breach, identifying the impact of the breach, identifying what type of information was in the breach, what's probably going to happen because of that. You have to give all that type of information to the supervisory authority. Yeah. There's another requirement too, which is if it is likely to cause harm to an individual or the data subject, you have to notify them without undue delay. So immediately, as soon as you know it and it's possible to cause that individual harm, you need to let them know immediately. If it's not, you only need to let the supervisory authority know. You do not have to notify the data subject immediately, but you do have to notify that supervisory authority.
So what you're saying is if it's going to cause harm, you can't wait until the 71st hour.
Yeah, you can't even wait. You can't even wait at all. As soon as you know it for the data subject, you need to let them know right away.
Right. So next, let's start to think about, as we're looking at all of these things to consider, let's kind of shift now over to what I've heard you talk a little about before, a data protection impact assessment, a DPIA. So what is a DPIA and why does that matter?
Yeah, so the GDPR requires, if it's applicable to you, that you perform a data protection impact assessment. And the data protection impact assessment is great because you're going to understand through that process where that personal data and information is, how you're storing it, how you're processing it. By the way, the GDPR will say that storing is processing. So there's even a different definition within GDPR of what processing means, believe that or not. And then how you're ingesting that information. When are you going to remove that information or destroy that information? How long are you keeping it? Why are you keeping it? And how you need to comply. So we just talked about breaches. Well, if you do a DPIA, that's going to help you understand how you're prepared to respond to a breach if that were to occur. So it's going to incorporate all the things that you need to be doing under GDPR to ensure that you're complying.
How big is that assessment?
Yeah.
It sounds like a lot, clearly. I know we've said before, I mean, we could talk for 2 weeks on all this stuff, but
sure.
Can you estimate at all how big something like this is?
Yeah, that's going to vary between organization to organization, but even here, the IAPP is one of the authorities on privacy, the International Association of Privacy Professionals. And in their handbook on GDPR, they reference 6 to 8 weeks to complete a DPIA. They say if you already have a lot of other compliance initiatives in place, so if you're already trying to comply with HIPAA or other privacy regulations, it might be more like 4 to 6 weeks. But you're guaranteed to be spending at least a month or two on performing and completing your DPIA.
So it takes some time.
It'll take some time.
Take some time.
Take some effort.
All right. So let's shift over to another thing to consider. So data consent. Now that is something I think we've all experienced, how we
Sure.
are consenting to whatever's happening on the screen.
Sure, we probably all consented more to more stuff than we even want to admit to. All of a sudden, we start getting emails from an organization that we knew we bought something from, but we never knew we were going to start getting emails from them. And all of a sudden, every day, you're getting an email. And a lot of times that occurs because when you sign up or when you buy something, there's a little pre-ticked box there that says, hey, we're allowed to collect this information and we're allowed to do this and send you this information. Under GDPR, for ingesting that information, no more pre-ticked boxes.
Now, so a pre-tick box, yeah, it's already there. Now, how does that impact? Like sometimes, have you're scrolling to like 1,000 pages, it seems like, trying to get to the bottom so you can hit accept. Is that going to be different too?
It should be different. So consent is supposed to be specific and unambiguous under GDPR. So it should be easy enough for anyone to read. Now, that's a challenge, right? Because
there's a lot going on.
If it's supposed to cover everything, but also be straightforward, how do you even do that? So that's a challenge for companies that they're going to have to battle with, especially companies that are obtaining consent all the time. Another thing is some organizations just collect cookies, or sometimes they just let you know they're collecting cookies when you visit their site. Under GDPR, the data subject has a right to say yes or no. So the pop-up needs to come up, and you need to say, yes, you can collect cookies, or no, you cannot.
This is a side question. Maybe this is going down a rabbit hole we don't need to, but why do you think the EU is being so much more protective over this versus the U.S.?
I think the EU has always led the U.S. in privacy over its citizens. I think the U.S. is becoming more and more aware of it as things happen in the news, and we start to see more and more companies getting breached and their information being stolen and used and identity theft. So I think the U.S. is starting to catch up from an awareness standpoint. The laws have not come down yet, and who knows what will happen from here. But I think the EU has always been a little bit ahead of the U.S. as far as considering the privacy of its citizens, and they're taking it very seriously. And I think you're going to continue to see more and more fines, more and more penalties, and potentially even more than that as they continue to roll out even more regulations, even related to e-privacy.
When we've talked to some of your other team members just over the last, I guess, years at this point, I've always loved hearing the stories of, they're scary stories, but it gets to a point where you start to hear about so many breaches and so many millions of people's information being breached. So when you look at, generally speaking, when you look at the U.S. and you compare that to the EU, are you normally not seeing as many of the terrifying breaches that we see in the U.S.?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say that, because that's really more related to security. Organizations within the EU are definitely still breached. Every company has their own
Nobody
struggles
is
with
safe.
security. Nobody is completely safe. So,
but best practice is what you're saying is they are
That's right.
totally leading the way.
That's right. They're definitely leading the way in privacy. In security, I don't know, but definitely in privacy and saying, hey, this information needs to be protected. You're collecting information about our citizens, and you need to treat that with respect. I think they're definitely leading the way there.
Okay, that's a great distinction. Now, do you think if the privacy of the information is being better protected, do you think that would make them less of a target?
In theory, it
but
should,
still
but it's
people
probably not. Yeah, I think everyone's always going to be
Okay.
under attack. Yeah.
So before we start to wrap up, there's one more thing to cover. So what else should we be considering?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things within the GDPR that, if you're protecting your information, are going to help your organization if something bad were to occur. A common term is pseudonymization, which is different than encryption and different than anonymization. If the data is truly anonymized, that means it can never, ever, ever, never, ever come back to that individual. It can never be brought back to that individual. Then you don't have to comply with GDPR. But that's not a good measure to try, because it's not really that possible. It's a pretty hard goal to achieve. And if it's that hard to achieve, you're probably not going to be able to utilize that. So pseudonymization is another good tool like encryption. So pseudonymization is my jumbled up information is here and you got that, and that's not tied to an individual, but what ties an individual back to that information is in a separate location. So that's a pretty simple way to put it is you can tie me back to this jumbled up info, but where that's kept, where you can tie me back, is on a separate, it's in a separate place, as opposed to encryption where that jumbled up information, so those are good tools to utilize that will help protect you under GDPR, whereas anonymization can truly help you just say, GDPR, you don't apply to me, but that's not generally a good method. It's not, because it's generally not possible.
When you talk about the methods, you talk about the different tools, all of this, I know right now the purpose of this is just to paint some picture, some clarity on this topic, but at any point, someone can connect with you and your team to really understand the different methods, tools, all the things in between. And how can someone connect with you?
Sure. lbmcinformationsecurity.com is a great place to start. You can also just Google LBMC GDPR, and it'll take you to our main GDPR landing page. There's lots of blogs, a webinar out there, as well as my contact information. You can always reach out to me as well.
Well, the fun doesn't stop just yet, because one thing we have to look forward to on the next part of this series is data subject requests.
Yeah, so we wanted to dedicate a whole episode to that because there's a lot to cover with that one requirement. Data subject requests are probably going to start coming in, especially if you're collecting a lot of EU citizens' information, and you need to know how to comply with that and what all those data subject access rights actually are.
Excellent. Well, let's jump to it. I enjoyed the chat, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, thanks.